the terrible danger we had just run having been dissipated by moving the powder wagons away, the marshal brought the infantry division forward to the center of the town. Once there, and wishing to secure, against offensive returns, the quarters he had already taken, he had, following the example of the Spaniards, all the windows of the principal streets occupied. These prudent measures taken, the marshal ordered the column to continue toward the bridge and instructed me to place myself at its head to lead it. I obeyed, although the task seemed very difficult to me, for it was the first time I had been in Ratisbon, and consequently I knew none of its streets. This town belonging to the King of Bavaria, our ally, the inhabitants, devoted to our cause, ought to have shown us the way to the bridge. But fear kept them in their homes, and not one was to be seen. All the doors and windows were closed, and we were too pressed for time to break them in, for at every crossroads groups of Austrians appeared, fired on us while retreating, then vanished. The enemy had no other line of retreat than the bridge over the Danube. I therefore thought I would reach it by following them, but there was so little concert among the Austrians that most of their skirmishing platoons posted before us fled at our approach in different directions. Thus led astray in the middle of that maze of unknown streets, I no longer knew where to direct the column, when, all at once, a door opened, and a young woman, pale, with wild eyes, rushed toward us in a panic, crying, "I am French, save me!" She was a Parisian milliner who, having set up shop in Ratisbon, and fearing that her being French would lead the Austrians to mistreat her, had rushed, without thinking, into the arms of her compatriots as soon as she heard French spoken. At the sight of this woman, a bright idea struck me as to the use we could make of our encounter. "You know where the bridge is?" I said to her. "Certainly." "Well then, lead us there." "Good God! In the middle of musket fire? I am dying of fright, and was coming to beg you to give me a few soldiers to defend my house, into which I am going back this instant. I am very sorry, but you will not go back there until you have shown me the bridge. Let 2 grenadiers take the lady by the arms, and make her march at the head of the column." So it was done, despite the tears and cries of the fair Frenchwoman, whom I questioned at each street corner about which direction to take. The nearer we came to the Danube, the greater the number of skirmishers. Bullets whistled past the ears of the frightened milliner, who, not knowing what they were, seemed far less affected by that little whistle than by the detonation of the muskets. But suddenly, one of the grenadiers supporting her had his arm pierced by a bullet, and the blood splashed onto her, her knees gave way, and she had to be carried. What had just happened to her neighbor made me more cautious on her behalf, and I had her placed behind the first platoon, whose men partly shielded her from the bullets. At last we reached a small square facing the bridge. The enemy, who occupied the far end of it, as well as the suburb on the left bank, called Stadt am Hof, seeing the column, began to cannonade us. I thought it useless to expose the Parisian any longer, and, to keep the promise I had made her, I set her free. But as the poor woman, more dead than alive, did not know where to hide, I suggested she go, for the moment, into a chapel of the Virgin situated at the end of the square. She agreed. The grenadiers lifted her over the little grating that protected the entrance, and she ran to take shelter from the projectiles, crouching behind the statue of the Virgin, where, I assure you, she took up very little space. The marshal, informed that we were on the bank of the Danube, moved to the head of the column and saw for himself that it was impossible to cross the bridge, the enemy having set fire to the suburb of Stadt am Hof, which abutted the left bank. While the French were delivering the assault and seizing Ratisbon, 6 Austrian battalions posted on the ramparts, far from the point of attack, had remained very calmly looking out over the countryside to see whether anyone was coming. They only emerged from their stupefied inaction when they heard firing toward the bridge. They ran there, but their retreat was cut off, first by us, and second by the burning suburb, which they could not have crossed, even if they had managed to get onto the bridge. They were therefore reduced to laying down their arms. The emperor entered Ratisbon that very day, and ordered the troops who had not fought to join the unfortunate inhabitants in combating the fire that was devouring the town. But, despite that powerful help, a large number of houses were burned. Napoleon, after visiting and rewarding the wounded, the glorious remnants of the first two columns whose efforts had failed, wished also to see the third column, the one that had taken Ratisbon before his eyes. He addressed words of satisfaction to us and bestowed several decorations. The marshal having reminded him of my former and recent claims to the rank of squadron leader, Napoleon answered, "That is a matter you may consider as done." Then, turning to Marshal Berthier, "You will have me sign that commission in the first set of papers you present to me." I had every reason to be pleased, and could not reasonably hope that the Emperor would suspend his important work in order to dispatch my commission a few days earlier. Besides, I was intoxicated by the marks of satisfaction that the Emperor, as well as Marshal Lannes, had just given me, and by the praise that my comrades and I were receiving from all sides. You may well suppose that before leaving the bridge, I had the Parisian removed from the chapel, and an officer escorted her home. The marshal, seeing the soldiers busy lifting that woman over the little grating, asked me how she had come to be there. I told him the story. He repeated it that evening to the Emperor, who laughed heartily and declared he would be very glad to see the lady. I have already told you that, at the moment when we were delivering the assault, the whole Grand Army, drawn up a short distance from the place, was witness to the fight. Among the many spectators were Marshal Masséna and his aides-de-camp, including Monsieur Pellet, now a lieutenant general, director of the war depot, and the author of an excellent account of the 1809 campaign. Here is what one reads in that work regarding the assault on Ratisbon. Marshal Lannes seized a ladder and was about to place it himself. His aides-de-camp stopped him and wrestled with him. At the sight of this noble contest, the crowd of our warriors rushed forward, seized the ladders, and crossed the space. The deadly shots were lost amid the throng. The aides-de-camp went in advance. In the twinkling of an eye, the ladders were set, the ditch was crossed. On the crest appeared the first two, hand in hand, Labédoyère and Marbot. Our grenadiers followed them. This eyewitness account is very accurate. It rightly gave equal glory to my comrade and to me. But the author of the biography of the unfortunate Labédoyère has not been as fair. After copying General Pellet's narrative, he thought proper to suppress my name and to attribute to Labédoyère alone the merit of having been the first to mount the assault at Ratisbon. I did not think it fitting to protest. Besides, General Pellet's work attests to the fact, which took place under the eyes of 150,000 men. Ratisbon had been taken on April the 23rd. The Emperor spent the 24th and 25th in that town, and ordered that all the damage be repaired at his expense, while Napoleon, accompanied by Marshal Lannes, was walking through the streets. I caught sight of the French milliner whom I had compelled, the day before, to guide the assault column toward the bridge. I pointed her out to the marshal. He indicated her to the Emperor, who, going up to her, paid her, jokingly, some compliments on her courage, and then sent her a very fine ring as a souvenir of the assault on Ratisbon. The crowd, both civilian and military, that surrounded the Emperor having inquired into the reason for this little scene, the facts were slightly distorted, for the lady was depicted as a French heroine who, of her own accord, had exposed herself to death in order to ensure the safety of her compatriots. That, then, was how the matter was told, not only in the army, but throughout all Germany, and by General Pellet himself, misled by public rumor. If the Parisian was for a time under the enemy's fire, the love of glory had nothing to do with it. During the short stay we made at Ratisbon, the marshal attached to his staff Lieutenant de la Bourdonnais, a young officer full of spirit and very brave, who was recommended to him by Senator Guéheneuc, father of the Marchioness. Monsieur de la Bourdonnais was in despair at not having arrived among us until after the assault, but he soon found other occasions to show his courage. Something odd even happened to him in that regard. The fashionable officers of the army had adopted trousers of enormous width, which were not without grace when one was on horseback, but were exceedingly troublesome on foot. Now, La Bourdonnais had one of those immense trousers when, at the combat of Wells, the marshal ordered him to dismount and run across the bridge to convey an order to the troops. The spurs of that good young man became entangled in his trousers. He fell, and we thought him dead. He sprang up very nimbly, and, wanting to run again, heard the marshal exclaim, "Is it not absurd to come to war with 6 ells of cloth around your legs?" La Bourdonnais, fighting for the first time under the marshal's eyes and eager to show zeal, then drew his sabre, cut and tore his trousers halfway up his thighs, and, now more agile, set off again, knees and legs bare. Although we were under enemy fire, the marshal and his staff laughed until they cried at that new costume, and, on his return, La Bourdonnais was congratulated on his presence of mind. After entrusting a strong garrison with the task of guarding Ratisbon and its bridge, the emperor directed the army toward Vienna along the right bank of the Danube, while the bulk of the enemy took the same direction along the left bank. I will not tire your attention with the story of the many combats we had to deliver against Austrian corps that tried to oppose our march toward the capital. I will confine myself to noting that Marshal Masséna, whose circumstances had, up to that point, kept his corps away from any engagement, committed the enormous imprudence, on May 3rd, of attacking the bridge of Ebersberg, on the Throne, although it was defended by 40,000 men supported by a fortified castle. That attack had become completely useless, since, before it had even begun, Marshal Lannes's corps had crossed the Throne 5 leagues above Ebersberg and was marching to take the Austrians in the rear. They would certainly have withdrawn that very day at our approach, without Masséna losing a single man. He therefore attacked to cross a river already crossed. He succeeded, but he had more than 1,000 soldiers killed and 2,000 wounded. The emperor condemned that deplorable misuse of men's blood, and, doubtless to give Masséna a lesson, he sent from Wales a single brigade of light cavalry under General Durosnel, who, going down the left bank of the Throne, reached Ebersberg without firing a pistol, just as Masséna's troops were entering it, after suffering heavy losses there and having 2 colonels killed and 3 others wounded. Napoleon went from Wales to Ebersberg by the right bank, which proved that the road was perfectly open. Upon arriving on the battlefield, the sight of so many men so uselessly killed broke his heart. He withdrew and saw no one that evening. Had anyone other than Masséna taken it upon himself, without orders, to make so imprudent an attack, he would probably have been sent to the rear, but it was Masséna, the darling child of victory, and the emperor thought it best to confine himself to a few severe remarks. The army, less indulgent, loudly criticized Masséna. For his excuse, he said that the 40,000 Austrians who defended Ebersberg, under General Hiller, having, not far from their right, a bridge over the Danube at Mauthausen, there was reason to fear that, if one did not attack that course promptly, without waiting for the arrival of the troops turning it by way of Wels, General Hiller would cross the Danube and go to join Prince Charles on the left bank. But, even if that supposition had proved true, it would not have resulted in any disadvantage for the French army. On the contrary, since all the enemy troops would then have been beyond the Danube, we would not have had a single shot to fire in order to march on Vienna along the right bank, entirely devoid of defenders. Moreover, the aim Masséna pursued in attacking Ebersberg was not achieved. General Hiller, after falling back 1 or 2 marches along the right bank, went to cross the Danube at Stein, and, going down the river on the left bank, made all haste to Vienna. Be that as it may, after crossing the Throne, burning the bridge at Mauthausen, and fording the river Enns, Napoleon's army advanced as far as Melk, without our knowing whether General Hiller was between Vienna and us, or whether he had crossed the Danube to join Prince Charles on the left bank. Some spies asserted, on the contrary, that it was the prince who had crossed the Danube to unite with General Hiller, and that we would encounter the next day the entire Austrian Grand Army in a strong position in front of St. Pölten. In that case, we had to prepare to deliver a great battle. In the opposite case, We had to march rapidly on Vienna so as to arrive there before the enemy army, which was moving toward the capital along the bank opposite the one we occupied. The emperor's uncertainty was very great, for lack of positive information that would have enabled him to resolve the question thus posed. Had General Hiller crossed the Danube, or was he still in front of us, masked by a screen of light cavalry, which, always fleeing, would not let itself be approached, so that no prisoners could be taken from whom some clarification might be obtained? Nothing was yet certain when, on May 7th, we reached Melk. It was at Melk, my dear children, that I performed that one of all my acts of war the memory of which flatters me the most, because the dangers I had run up to that day had been imposed on me in executing the orders given by my commanders, whereas here it was voluntarily that I braved death, to be useful to my country, to serve my emperor, and to acquire a little glory. That concludes the 12th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.